everybody. Welcome to the Fire It Up with CJ show. Today we are going to be talking about passing judgment, praise and blame in everyday life. And we have Dr. Terri Apter here from Cambridge University from the UK here. And I'm excited to talk to you, not only to get kind of a perspective on something that I suffer from. If I have one emotion that is my nemesis, it's guilt, which is, of course, related to self-blame. I guess that's how I've just seen it written in your book, self-blame. So I'm hoping to get cured from this conversation. And you had written in the book that you've been studying identity, family dynamics, and friendships, I presume, at Cambridge University.
Yeah.
And that one of the things that you've been fascinated on is judgment. And I wanted to find out a little bit about your experience and what you were researching, what you found overall.
Well, let's start with parents and, newborn children, because that's actually where my research started many, many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fascinated by the way that usually a mother, but parent and baby would lock eyes together. It's almost like eye love, they're fascinated by one another. And very soon the baby becomes very interested in that powerful expression, that powerful praise. Gosh, you're so wonderful. I'm very curious about you. I want to know about you. I'm sure you're wonderful. I'm sure you're good. And I want to know that. And how difficult it was for the baby if he or she felt that the parent wasn't positively engaged, having this rush of praise and admiration, if that seemed to dry up. I mean, sometimes it could just be because the parent was distracted or distressed or thinking of something else. But for whatever the reason, baby would quickly become very disturbed. And it takes a long time for that infant to calm down when they've lost that assurance that the parent is saying, gosh, you're wonderful, gosh, you're wonderful.
Oh, that's fascinating, yeah.
Later on, I think children become quite critical of what a parent is or what any grown-up is praising them for. So if they're trying to do something that's quite difficult, they want praise, but they want praise to acknowledge what they're doing. I mean, praise isn't always good. Praise can fall short. Praise can be patronizing. It can indicate that the person isn't really appreciating what the efforts are. But children are also thing. If someone expresses anger, you can see the way their whole demeanor changes. Their shoulders sag. Their mouth turns down, they sort of become frozen. It's really difficult. It's really threatening to them.
So one of the things that from the very instance where you're talking about babies who, of course, don't understand language, they're still communicating. Adults are communicating with children through their body language as well. And I think that that's kind of something that I hadn't thought about. And the thing that also in your book that I hadn't thought about is I think about passing judgment as kind of a negative thing because I come from a spiritual lens, and it's always about you should never pass judgment on another person. But it's kind of a ridiculous concept because in order to feel safe, we're always kind of judging the situation as being safe or not. That was another thing that I drew from your book, Passing Judgment.
Well, indeed. Often we say, don't judge me, meaning don't form a negative opinion of me. But judgment covers both positive appraisal as well as negative appraisal. So when I say, I think you're wonderful, that's a judgment. And of course, I express I think you're wonderful or I think you're not wonderful in all sorts of ways without actually saying it. Mm-hmm. So, we're very, very sensitive to reading faces. Mm-hmm. And faces express far more than we may intend to express of our approval or disapproval. I mean, there are all sorts of ways our face just leaks information that we may not want to leak. We may try to disguise, but it's well known. We think we can smile convincingly when we don't feel like smiling. That's much more difficult to do than we ordinarily believe. Mm-hmm. There are also little micro expressions that we may not be aware of, but we nonetheless feel their effects. So if I pause, I mean, my children are very good at reading me. If they ask me something and I pause, they say, "You don't like it, you don't want it." That can be disconcerting. So, every interaction has some kind of an evaluation in it. And I think this goes way, way back to the fact that we as people living in an uncertain environment have to assess, is someone trustworthy? Is someone cooperative? Is this someone I want to approach? Or is this someone I should really try to avoid? And of course, this becomes much more sophisticated as we develop. We don't only, we don't only care, is someone going to attack me? Is someone going to help me gather food or whatever? But we also ask, is someone on my wavelength? Do they understand me? Do they appreciate me? Can I talk to them easily? Is this someone I'd like to be like? Or is this someone I really feel uncomfortable with, who doesn't have my sense of humor, isn't interested in the kinds of things I am, doesn't, speak the same language, as it were, language very broad. So we're always making assessments like this.
So I want to go back to, there's this, thou shalt not judge another. And it's like, please do not say anything negatively if you really don't know what the situation is kind of but what I'm hearing you say is that you have to judge. You're constantly judging in order to feel that there's social safety among a group, to understand how you're fitting in. So how would you amend the thou shalt not judge? I mean, so that, and then I'm also hearing, even if you feel like you're not saying anything, you're saying something with your body, these little micro expressions. So if the thou shalt not judge, is that from an academic perspective, is that just a ridiculous notion?
Well, often the Bible tells us to do things that are really very difficult. And I think, judge not lest ye be judged is a reminder that other people are also judging you, that you're very vulnerable to other people's judgment. But it's also a reminder that your judgments are vulnerable to all sorts of biases, incomplete knowledge, and all sorts of foibles. But I would say the directive, don't judge, is impossible. That's what humans do. I think we're doing it in a way all the time.
Right.
So I would say is, you're going to judge, but so the most important thing is to think about when your judgments are sound, when they're really, expressing your deep needs, your goals, your emotions, that's important. You've got to go by that. But also be aware that they're vulnerable to a lot of biases. And so in the book, I'm saying these are a lot of the biases that we're prone to every day. This is how we can describe them. It always helps to describe something and to give examples so that you're more aware of it, and so that it's more palatable. If you realize that we are judgmental beings, we're doing judgment, then instead of trying to suppress it, we can try to make it much better.
So what are the biases that we're subjected to?
Well, of course, one of the big biases is the self-serving bias. It's so important for me to think well of myself. I think that's it's so well to think well of myself that my brain is going to help me do that even when I don't have the proper evidence to do it. So one of the first studies the student in psychology learns is about the question that you pose to people. Are you a bad, average, or better than average driver? Mm-hmm. And most people say they're better than average. That's not possible because
right.
average, most people are, most drivers are average drivers, but most people think that they're much, much better than average. And will be not only driving, it so happens that preliminary.
Right. So there's a bias to be right. There's a bias to be better, is what I'm hearing. That's the self bias.
Yes, bias to be better, and yes, and also I can, and our memories help us with this bias. So I'm much more likely to remember when someone else didn't give me fair credit for what I had done, that someone else took credit for a lot of work that I did or a lot of help that I gave them. But if you were to say, well, okay, that's self-serving bias, you're saying a lot of people have it, you must have it too.
Right.
When did you not give fair credit to someone? My memory will save me.
Right.
And I won't be able to remember something, even though in all probability, I'm average in that way.
What are some other biases that we have that kind of distort our sense?
Okay, so the other bias is, and again, this is self-serving, but so if I lose my temper and I'm really unfair to a colleague, or, I can see that I've been nasty to a friend, I will say, gosh, I'm hungry, I'm tired, I'm really under stress. It's not really me, it's something in my environment that is
right.
making me behave this way. But if someone else loses his or her temper, I'll think, what a bad-tempered person,
Right.
Really nice. So that's one.
Yes.
But one of the most important ones, and we see it all too often in our society, is the them and us bias. So people I think of as like me, or I associate with in some way, I think they're more entitled to warmth, to food, to wealth. Right. To law, protection of the law, but people I see as them for some reason. That there's it could be skin color, it could be ethnicity, it could be religion, it could be something entirely different. But it's often, all too often, those things. Then somehow they're less than us, and all the empathy that I have for the people around me, the people who are like me, can close off when it's them, when they're in a group that I think of as, just not part of me, not part of my world. And even if I can see what it is they're thinking, even if I can, I can understand their perspective, it may be that my empathy for their suffering is cut off. And that, of course, means that I might be in a position, or when we're in that position, we're willing to see great harm done to them. And that's pretty devastating.
Mm. Okay, so I want to take a recent example that's really hot off the presses. And, 2 weeks ago, we had this shooting where this teenager came and shot 17 people. And now the aftermath is, a bunch of students saying, going over to, the politicians and saying, please, can you just change the gun laws? And then fingers pointing to the NRA. It's the NRA's fault. And, now I saw that a bunch of people aren't buying, companies are withdrawing their support from the NRA. And then it's about the gun laws. It's about the students. It's about legislation. It's about the guard that didn't rush in. It was about the teachers that should be armed. So there's all this kind of blame that's circling around. And so from your academic perspective, what would you say is happening with respect to the biases, and what's the framework that you put all this chaos that is descending upon us right now?
Okay, well, there's nothing like fear to trigger that them us bias. I mean, on the one hand, fear can make us closer to the people, who we think of as us. If someone comes into my college and starts shooting, then I'm not going to care about some little differences I've had with a colleague. Or I'm not going to care that this student has frustrated me. It's going to be, that fear will draw us together. And, the little things that once bothered us and that once made us seem different and drew conflict, that will go. And I'll just be, we'll be all together. But other people who are outside of this us circle will seem more threatening, and and I'll be willing to cast more blame on them and think they deserve greater punishment. There's also something called threat rigidity. When I'm under threat, I'm much less likely to reflect on my judgments, much less likely to change my way of looking at things. And so I'll become very set in my ways. But what you have as well here, this is sort of in the aftermath. You're saying this awful thing happened. There must be a reason, and that reason we frame as someone is to blame.
Right.
Something went wrong with me. And, it's true. It's true someone was to blame. Someone pulled the trigger, and then you think, well, he shouldn't have had a gun, and someone sold him the gun. And I think all of those things are true.
The mental health authorities didn't, that he was reported, no one responded. It's like there's not one, but many points along the way of which I think that different choices would have been better, right? But, he had a gun, he wasn't stopped. There wasn't a guard that stopped him. I mean, there was a series of things, but it seems like we are all boiling it down to one thing. NRA, it's the guard, it's the mental health. I don't know. So what you're saying is that we want to blame someone because there's like a fear, like, well, this could happen to my child, so there's this us versus them thing that comes up. And then it seems like there's this boiling down into like one person that I want to point my finger to.
Yes, that's sort of satisfying in a way, because it makes you feel safer if you're able to say, if it hadn't been for this person or this action or this omission, then people would have been safe. But it's also a way of, it's that kind of reflection is important because it allows us to think how we want to change things, how we want to change the whole system. So that it's less likely to happen again. And, it's not just, our biases aren't always things that we should simply reject and set aside. Our tendency to think about who's to blame, how did it happen, what's the context, is also productive. It's a way of going forward. And that, I think, is something we should always have when we blame someone. I mean, taking it back to the very personal context in which a parent is blaming a child. Let's say a child, we have to blame our children. It's a very, very important teaching tool. We have to be able to say, you did something, and as a consequence, something bad happened. Or you did, you hit someone, you were careless, something happened. That's a way of teaching our children agency, and that certain things are acceptable and certain things are not. But it's devastating if you just stop there. What you want to do as well is to say, well, I believe that in the future you can do better. And, this is something, you can learn from, and framing it in terms of, you're not going to do that again, are you? It's quite a jump from that intimate, trusting relationship to responses after, this terrible shooting.
Okay, so wait. So I think I have a aha. So you're saying that if we actually take the model of a parent with a child, let's say that the child cheated on a test or something, and that's something that you don't want them to do, right? So you say, you cheated on a test. I understand the factors that went into that, but you can do better, right? So that's like a kind of, a somewhat medium-sized infraction, right? Well, maybe not where you are, but, as a parent, it's a medium-sized infraction to me, right? No one died. Okay, but in the case of, like, someone got shot, somehow we don't have that same kind of rational, measured response. It's this kind of, it's not the, hey, here are the various factors, we can do better. It just continues at this pointing game, and there's not this, to me, the resolution of, like, we can do better. Let's look at what caused this. Let's look at some of the solutions. It's a multi-pronged, multi-step thing. There's not one factor. We don't go there. I haven't heard one person on the news say that. I've heard this, like, just pointing at all different people being to blame.
Yeah. So what you've just described is, this has happened. Let's sit down and look at all the factors, because with anything, there are a lot of causal factors. The child who cheats on an exam can say, well, it should be monitored more carefully. If it weren't so easy to cheat on these exams, I wouldn't.
Right. It's the system, right?
It's more difficult. Yes, I actually did have a friend whose son didn't cheat on an exam, but he would cheat on tickets for a train because they were only checked, every fifth time or something. And she was saying it's the fault of the system, of the train regulator, that they're not checking these, that he has a valid ticket.
Right.
So of course he's going to try not to buy a ticket for this journey.
Right.
So there is something to that. I mean, you want to look at the environment. You want to, make sure it's robust. But for, something awful happened, and you think things are safe. You think that these things have happened before and people are alert, and yet it happens again. So you want to, sit back and say, why? What can we do about it? I mean, something comparable, but even more difficult to manage would be, let's say there's a train accident, a derailment, and someone's killed. And then there's lots of things. What happened? What are all the things that happened? What are all the things that didn't happen? What were the checks? How come the checks were if the checks were made, then the checks are clearly inadequate. And then you have to think, sometimes stuff happens. You don't say that when there's a shooting, but maybe you do when there's a derailment. And then you have to weigh up exactly how much effort are we going to do to assure people this will never happen again. And you may people who support gun ownership or gun ownership of any kind would say, well, you can't take away liberties. You can't take away our liberty just because someone else behaved badly.
Right. Yeah. And this goes back to, and I've been trying to think, and maybe I'm kind of formulating after reading your book, Passing Judgment, the idea of social psychology, right? So there's a group of people, the social psychology is like, you can't blame all the NRA, people who carry rifles for the act of one person, that kind of acted inappropriately.
Yeah.
And then there's a social psychology. It's like, we don't feel safe going to school. I don't know, what is it? You talk about social psychology as being a very important aspect of this judgment game. So where does that factor into this context?
Well, social psychology is simply talking about it in the way we're talking about it, and noticing that this is how people behave, this is how people respond. And then you would look and say, well, it's not guns, it's people who use guns in a certain way, though that isn't actually true either, because there are so many deaths by accidental deaths from guns. But let's just look at the argument. It's not the fault of the gun, it's the person wielding the gun. But in a country in which you're not allowed to have gun ownership, and there are fewer such incidents. So
so the social psychology, I didn't know what social psychology is. The social psychology is basically, that's what we're talking about. That's what you're saying. Okay. Sorry for my ignorance. Now I know. Okay. Tell me about the neuroscience part of it. Where does the neuroscience piece come into this context?
Right. Okay.
Unless we've been talking about that too, and I didn't realize that. New territory.
Is interesting because it gives another picture to what we sort of know already, or we may know already. So I've already told you, without anything about neuroscience, about the way in which children are very responsive to both praise and blame, and they seem to open up and flourish in certain kinds of praise, though I think it would be interesting to see ways in which praise can also be annoying and patronizing and controlling. But on the baby level, they really love it, and how disapproval makes them freeze and close down. Well, you can actually see this as a neuroscientist, because when they feel they're admired, they feel that they're a great blessing, that they're wonderful to the people who matter to them, their brains are filled with all these wonderful chemicals.
Oxytocin, right, yeah.
Oxytocin and the endorphin compounds. And this actually facilitates brain growth in the sense of more and more connections, positive connections. And you're able to learn more, you're able to, the brain becomes what's called more plastic, more responsive to the environment, able to learn more things and more things. Whereas in a context in which a child feels disapproved, and that can include neglect, and it can include abuse, as well as just, I don't think you're good enough. That is very stressful, and that releases the chemical cortisol, which is really toxic to the developing brain. And there are fewer connections that develop. So there's less going on in the brain. There's less of that very important growth in communication in different brain. The allows us to learn, and also less plasticity in the brain. So, it's more difficult to catch up later, even if things improve in your environment. But another thing that's been found, and this is almost on the biological level rather than neuroscience, and that is that it's, social status is a kind of praise in the environment. You walk around and people respect you. People say hello to you. People are glad to see you, or at least respectful of you, and will listen to you, and you are able to feel that you have a positive impact on their lives. If you're very, very low status, it's likely that people might shun you, people might suspect you, distrust you, try to avoid you. Well, people who live in this social environment of higher status will live 17 years longer.
Wow.
And this seems to be on a very cellular level.
Wow.
That the stress of being low status really impacts on our physiology. And, we're not as healthy. It seems to suppress our immune system. And, that's a big difference. And it's something that, how important that is to feel walking around that you're worth something, that other to praise you, and then people low status where they feel they just don't have a chance.
Okay, so I want to bring up a different context away from the shooting and more about two different things that I'm observing. The other big trend that's happening is this Me2 movement, and I'm finding two really interesting things that I'm observing. So I have a son who is in college, and I was talking to a friend of his who was in college, and I just went to a at Duke University where my son goes. There was a women's forum. And there was a woman who stood up and she said, "I am just so sick of men. I feel like I just have to school them all the time, and they're just constantly. I'm having to fight them all the time, and I'm just so tired." And it was interesting. So I thought, wow. Well, why are you fighting with them? I would be tired if I were fighting with them too. But I was talking to my son, and I said, "So how are you feeling as a man, like an Asian man?" And he was with a white man, and they said, it feels bad to be a white man now. It just feels like I'm thinking about the neuroscience. They're getting negative messages about being a white man, and in their social stage of development, they're both in college, but they're being shunned and considered less than in the society that they live in because they're a man, and they haven't, these kids haven't done anything. They haven't had a Me Too experience where they treated a woman. And what my son said is, he said, it's really hard because I feel like I'm instantly judged when people don't even know me. If you know me, then you can point out, all my particular ills. But if you don't know me and you're just judging me because I'm a certain gender, it feels really bad. And so I just think that that's an interesting and cautionary tale that we have to be careful about in getting enlightening people to a real problem, that we don't create another problem.
Absolutely.
So that was just so worrisome to me. But when you talk about the neuroscience, I think, are we going to have a whole bunch of disempowered men that we're now? So what would you have to say about this?
Well, okay, I won't make predictions, but I take it as a cautionary tale, and I think it's very, very rough. So what's good about the Me Too movement? Well, what's really good about it is that, in certain cases, you can see how women were saying, I'm very uncomfortable with this person. This person is a danger to me. This person has offended me, assaulted me, raped me, and no one will believe me. And if I speak out, I'll just be punished.
Right.
So, that is terribly low status.
Right.
it's a you're harmed. That's too bad. This person is a genius, or this person is privileged, or
The
this
CEO of a
person.
company, yeah.
There's nothing you can do about it. Get over it or not. But
Right.
we're not. You're not going to. Your right to be treated as a human being is
Right,
not
absolutely.
acknowledged in this case. So with enough people speaking out, then it becomes more plausible, and the people who are speaking out become more powerful, and that's certainly a force for good to say being a genius, being CEO, being powerful, being rich, it's not enough. I mean, you don't get credit, so much
Right, you
credit for
can't use
that.
this power differential to harm to justify harm of another.
Right.
That's
So, on the other hand, but so it tends to be the younger women, or certainly women younger than me, who are speaking out. And what I would say is, when I was a very young woman, yes, I could see men like that. There were men like that, but we knew that they were bad people. I mean, we could
right.
see it, and it wasn't everyone. It may have been a common theme, but it wasn't everyone. And what may be happening now is that people standing up and saying, I've been silenced, I've been dissed, I've been told that that my pain doesn't matter, and now it does matter. Um, that, that that can mean now I have the power, and I'm going to make all of you suffer.
Right.
You that that isn't any good.
Right.
I mean, that can, and I think that the Me Too movement has to be able to distinguish, if it's going to be a force for good, then there has to be a distinction between who did offend them and who did not,
Right.
and who thought it was fine to behave like that and who did not. And it's also, when we're looking at biases, there's something called a self-confirmation bias. So if I have an idea in my head or a
Mm.
feeling that's very strong, then I look around and I see lots of cases that confirm that.
Mm.
And cases that don't confirm it just sort of drop off my radar.
Yes. Yeah.
So we have to keep those, good, decent men, husbands, partners we've loved, sons we've raised. We have to keep them in mind too. And we don't want to silence them or to put it's a real bias, putting
Absolutely.
all men in the same
Right.
category just because some have behaved badly.
Right. Yeah. So, and then I have a flip side. I love that. And I think I love the self confirmation bias. And it speaks to what I saw as the flaw. I mean, I'm seeing as a potential flaw. And I don't know if it's young women generally, but this kind of, and you've stated it perfectly. It's now the power balance has shift. So now let me actually suppress you, and it's like, it's
Yeah,
just about
yeah,
like,
yeah.
really, that's almost just as bad as it's kind of hypocrisy, because you're saying you were in power and you oppressed me. Well, now I'm going to be in power and I'm going to oppress you. Like
And I mean, you can see it on a big scale looking at history. The French Revolution. I mean, the aristocrats did oppress the the ordinary people, but then the ordinary people came to power, and they started oppressing everyone.
Yes, this is the two wrongs don't make a right. Okay, so here's another thing that I saw that there were just so many things that sprung up after this women's forum, and one of them was for women who say sorry too much. There's
Right.
and it's almost you talk about it as self blame, And what was interesting is that if they're fundamentally underlying that belief is that people we care that that people we care about would be better off without us, and so we have this kind of underlying. I mean, I'm maybe not explaining it correct, but from your perspective as an academic, how would you explain this like I feel like as a woman I apologize, and I've made a pact myself to not apologize, because sometimes I apologize for things that, if I actually did something like I spilled your coffee all over the place and ruined your white suit, I actually am sorry because I'm accountable for that action. It harmed you in some way. I'm sorry. But people in the UK, it's just which I learned this tendency is you say sorry, I'm sorry, 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 sorry. You say sorry for like breathing and existing and having space in the universe. So what is this? How would you diagnose this? I'm sorry epidemic, I would say.
Okay, well, I mean, you've brought up a lot of things there.
I know. That's how I am. I'm sorry.
Let's go to the women. I think and again, this isn't inbuilt. This isn't essential to women's nature, but people who are accustomed to having less power are more attentive to other people's judgments than people who have more power. They have to monitor other people's responses a bit more carefully, and they may anticipate having causing offense. And I think that the sorry bit isn't necessarily it's a downside. You're right. You should try not to say it too often or try not to feel it too often. But on the other hand, I think it goes in tandem with you are doing things that are that you want to do, that you want to say, and then suddenly there's this, oh, should I have said this? And oh, I wasn't perfect, or oh, I'm in your space. And you anticipate so it's anticipating disapproval, but it may be that you're anticipating disapproval while you're half going about expressing yourself and getting things done. So it's not always only a bad thing, but feeling, if you really feel that you are worthless to the people around you, if your very existence offends them, then that's far deeper, I think, than that little tick that a lot of us have of saying, oh, sorry. That's really shame, where you feel people would be better off without me. Mm-hmm. And I'm nothing. And that sense of mortification that we have when we feel, we're just polluting the social atmosphere or the personal atmosphere. We're not adding anything to that. And I think you only get to that state when there's so much blame and dislike and bias against you, and people are always putting you into that category of not good, distasteful, unclean, whatever all of the words that, or all of the ideas that people have about what we don't want as part of us. And being filled with shame is really a horrible place to be. It's a colleague of mine who's a psychiatrist says it's like the death of the self. And mortified means it comes from the Latin to die. So you really feel as though you're dead, or you might as well be.
So help me explain the whole phenomenon. You have it in Canada and you have it in England, and now it's starting to be in the U.S. where you say, "Oh, sorry." So the Canadian version is like, oh, sorry. Like, I'm sorry for, like, you hit someone, you're jostling, and sorry. You're on the
Yeah.
train, someone hits each other, sorry. You sneeze, sorry. Like, so what is that all about then?
You've described, and I think very rightly, the type of situation in which that often occurs, and that's quasi-public, where you don't really know the people. I think it's difficult living in a crowded planet, and we're not quite sure what it is, what kind of thing we have a right to, and what kind of thing might offend other people, and
Mm,
we don't want to offend them. So, I don't think it. I don't think it necessarily indicates a deep-seated um, sense that we're worthless, but it suggests uncertainty about what's acceptable to other people. And I think we are living in a social environment in which each of us we can very easily become very uncertain about what's okay to other people.
mm. Yeah, so you're saying that that's more like, I'm not sure. I'm in an environment where I'm with lots of different people on a
Yeah,
subway. I have no idea what will offend you and what will not offend you. So just to be safe, I'm going to say
yeah,
sorry for everything.
yeah. And also, it may be that you think they're a little dangerous, and so you want to placate them.
Right. Yes, that's
Um,
true.
yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you about gossip. And so you say, I found myself, I was just in a meditation retreat, and with a whole bunch of people I didn't know. And I found a really interesting thing happening. So you have a whole bunch of people, you're trying to like suss out, where do I fit? What's this community all about? And I found that what was happening on these side conversations with gossip. Can you believe he said la 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 la? I think blah 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 blah. And then like, oh well, she said blah 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 blah. So there's this gossiping happening. And from a spiritual perspective, you're at a retreat, and the whole goal is to love all. So this whole gossiping thing, it felt very. I had an inner conflict about having this sense of gossip, but then also still a need to talk about some stuff that was happening since I wanted to process. So I wanted to ask you about gossip because you mentioned that there is a positive aspect of gossip. Um, can you tell me what that is, and maybe in that particular context?
Well, gossip is, first of all, something we all do, and it's associated with women, but men do it just as much, though in a slightly different way. And gossip is exchanging information about your responses, your judgments about to other people, and also news about other people, but often with, isn't this great? Or isn't
Right,
it great for
right,
her, but isn't it
right.
awful? Or isn't that awful? Can you believe? Can you
Well, yeah,
believe
or
she
maybe it's like, and they're awful. Can you believe this? Aren't they awful? I mean, that was the thing that I noticed was
seems
happening.
so nice? She seems so nice,
Yeah.
but you can see how that's a good warning. Gosh, don't be taken in by her. She seems so nice. But in the situation in which everyone is new to everyone, you're not sure. I think this person is a little bit weird, or I think his response is just doesn't make sense. He's always talking about himself, really.
Right.
All those things, you want to test that with other people's responses because we know, I mean, as judgmental as we know our, judgments
Uh,
aren't always right. We can change our view of people, and gossip helps us do that. I mean, it can also
mm,
be very destructive because the person who's gossiped about doesn't always hear what's said and so can't defend himself. And in the workplace, if someone makes a mistake and someone else says to the boss, oh yeah, he's always doing that, it's very difficult to say, no, this was a one off and this is why it happened. So it can be, and of course, lots and lots of stories, films, novels in which negative gossip is very destructive.
Right.
But it's also a basis of how we get to know other people, and who is it who shares our responses to other people.
Okay, got it. So what I'm hearing is that, when you're basically trying to figure out, am I safe? And if I'm not safe, who are the people
Yeah,
I should
yeah,
avoid? And so gossip helps normalize. Like, is it just me, or does everyone think that guy talks too much?
yeah,
Or yeah,
yeah,
so it helps you kind of normalize and get. So it's almost the most positive, productive way. It's actually getting clear with what your bias is, because it may be your own particular bias. So by talking to several people, you're kind of like,
yeah.
no, I'm not that way. A lot of other people also, are judging that this person talks too much in the class.
Or
Okay.
they may have useful information that I don't have,
Right.
and so might help put things in perspective.
I see. Okay. And then the other question that you mentioned, or one of the things that you mentioned in your book, Passing Judgment, is you talk about um, the ideal, we talk about praise, which you didn't talk a lot about in the show, and the best balance between praise and blame as a ratio. And can you tell us a little bit more about that and what that is?
Yeah, so this is work that's done on couples, and the question, and couples have an ideal of total acceptance and not judgment. What's quite obvious is when you look at couples interacting is that they judge one another both positively and negatively on a very wide range, for a very wide range of things. And a lot of the, laughing at a joke, oh, you're so clever, tell me more, this is really interesting. All of those things are implicit praise. But, blame can be, I shouldn't have to ask you. You should know what I need. You should know I find that
Oh, the
annoying.
mind reading part. Okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
I was counting on you to do this, and you didn't do this. So the negative stuff is always there, and it does have a much bigger impact than the positive stuff, which is what you sort of take for granted and hope for in any close relationship, friendship, or marriage. But it's been found that um, you need 5 interchanges that involve praise for every negative, blame like interaction if that marriage is going to succeed rather than fail.
Interesting.
And
And that interesting.
yeah, you know, you can even take a 3 hour conversation or exchange with couples and monitor the praise and blame statements, and then make a prediction as to whether 5 years on that couple will be together.
And
And this is
is this from the Gottman Institute or someplace else?
this was work that was done by John Gottman, who started collecting this information in the 1970s. So he has a very large sample. I mean, last count, it was something like 3,000 couples.
Mm.
And, the analysis of the interchanges is very sophisticated and complicated, and it contains not only what they say, but also their physiological responses, their heart rate, their body language, whether they're fidgeting, how much are they perspiring, what their blood pressure is. So you can be pretty sure when you're dealing with a blame-like situation or a praise-like situation, even though you need a lot of context normally to know always to catch out what's a positive versus what's a negative interaction. So if
I was thinking, I'm wondering whether that's true of all interactions, because my son yesterday, my husband was like, "Hey, I wanted to give you feedback," and he's like, "I've had enough feedback," and he's like, "You really have to ask yourself if you really need to tell me this." because
Yeah.
I'm at my limit. And I think that when I really think of, if I look at the course of this last week, it's probably the opposite ratio of, no, it's like 5 to 0, you know.
Well, there are times like that. I think it is different with children, especially young adults, teens, young adults, when they're so judgmental themselves about you. But when you say, what do you dislike most? They'll say, I hate people judging me. And yet they're
Mm,
judging the people. And they're trying very much to develop their own sense of identity by distinguishing their judgments from those of their parents.
mm,
And they're very,
mm,
they're hypercritical, both very quick to think you're blaming them and very quick to criticize the praise you give. The praise that you're giving, it doesn't, that you're praising the little child they no longer are. It shows, praising them for something shows you don't really understand them, you don't know who they are. And I think also there's something incredibly robust about that parent-child relationship, so that it survives those weeks in which
what you're helping me conclude is just say nothing, which is what my son often asks us to do. Just don't say anything. This
yeah,
would be preferable to your current behavior because it's exhausting to me. So I think, don't praise me, don't blame me, just don't say anything.
but then you get in trouble for that
Yeah.
too, because you don't care about
Yeah,
me.
that's true. Talking to Dr. Terri Apter about her book, Passing Judgment, Praise and Blame in Everyday Life. And we just touched upon modern day, kind of trends, things that are happening right now. But in the book, it's, how does this happen in all contexts at work, with your love relationship, with your kids, with your peers, and how all of this plays out. And so we just touched upon a very small aspect of it. So if you want to learn more about this topic, get Passing Judgment. So thank you so much. And tell us your website too before we close on the
Oh,
radio.
it's terriapter.com.
TerriApter.com.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've been talking to Terri Apter about her book, Passing Judgment, Praise and Blame in Everyday Life.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. Would love your support in any way by giving me comments below, or to subscribe to the show, or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.